Imagine a remote mountain tent, ripped open from the inside. Boots, coats, and food are untouched, yet 9 experienced hikers have fled into a sub-zero night. Some are found dead from hypothermia, but others have crushed skulls and broken ribs. This isn't a murder mystery novel. It's the real unsolved case of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. In February 1959, 9 young hikers, most of them students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, set out on what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, a confident, disciplined, and respected mountaineer. The group included 8 men and 2 women, all of them seasoned hikers used to the harsh winters of the Ural Mountains. They carried skis, tents, food, and supplies to last the trip. For them, this was meant to be both a test of skill and an official sports qualification hike. By all accounts, they were ready for the challenge. But what awaited them on those frozen slopes was something no one could have imagined. The mystery began when the hikers failed to return, as scheduled. Families grew anxious, and soon a search operation was launched. It took weeks before searchers stumbled across the group's abandoned campsite, and what they found immediately raised questions that have haunted investigators for decades. The tent was discovered partly collapsed and covered in snow. At first glance, it looked like any other tent abandoned by a group caught in a storm. But when rescuers examined it closely, they saw something strange. The canvas had been slashed open from the inside, as though the hikers had cut their way out in a desperate hurry. Inside lay boots, coats, food, and essential gear that no one in their right mind would leave behind in freezing conditions. Everything suggested a sudden, panicked flight. But the question was, from the tent, investigators followed a line of footprints in the snow. The prints were clear enough to show that some hikers had been barefoot, while others wore only socks or single shoes. The tracks led downhill toward the edge of a forest nearly a mile away. There, at the base of a cedar tree, searchers found the first 2 beasts. Both were dressed only in underwear, without shoes or coats, lying near the remains of a small fire. It was clear they had died from hypothermia, but their lack of clothing raised immediate questions. Why abandon warm clothes in deadly cold? Why risk running into the snow nearly naked? Not far from them lay 3 more bodies, including that of Igor Dyatlov. They were positioned as though they had been trying to crawl back toward the tent. Like the first 2, they were lightly dressed and showed no signs of external injuries. It appeared they too had succumbed to the brutal cold. By this point, 5 hikers were accounted for, but 4 were still missing. When the final 4 were located months later, buried beneath several feet of snow in a nearby ravine, the mystery deepened further. Unlike the others, these bodies told a very different story. 2 had severe chest fractures, injuries so extreme that one investigator compared the force required to that of a car crash. Another hiker had a fractured skull, while one of the women was missing her tongue. Yet, strangely, there were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts, nothing that explained how such massive internal trauma had been inflicted. To this day, the nature of those injuries remains one of the central mysteries of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The combination of details was baffling. A tent slashed open from within. Hikers fleeing barefoot into sub-zero temperatures, some dying of exposure, others with injuries inconsistent with a fall or an animal attack. Theories began to swirl almost immediately, and over the decades, they have only multiplied. Some point to an avalanche, suggesting the hikers panicked and ran, though critics argue the slope was too shallow. Others believe the hikers were attacked by someone or something, but no footprints or evidence of intruders were ever found. Then there are the more outlandish idea-secret Soviet military tests, UFOs, or paranormal forces. Each theory explains some elements but leaves others unanswered. What makes the case so enduring is not just the mystery of the deaths, but the fact that these were experienced hikers who should have known how to survive in such conditions. They weren't reckless amateurs. They had faced blizzards before, they had trained for emergencies, and yet something on that mountain drove them into chaos. Something terrified or forced them into actions that defied common sense. The official investigation at the time did little to clarify the situation. Soviet authorities ruled that the hikers died from a compelling natural force, a phrase that only deepened the ambiguity. Was it nature? Was it human interference? Or something else entirely? No clear answers were given, and the case was closed. Families were left with more questions than answers, and the wider world was left with one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Even decades later, new investigations continue. In recent years, researchers revisited the avalanche theory, arguing that a rare type of delayed slab avalanche could have caused the panic. Computer models and forensic reconstructions lend some weight to the idea, but skeptics point out inconsistencies, particularly the strange injuries and the fact that the tent site showed no obvious signs of avalanche debris. The debate continues, as it always has. For now, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved, a chilling reminder of how even experienced adventurers can find themselves at the mercy of something they cannot control or explain. The ripped tent, the barefoot tracks in the snow, and the broken bodies found months later still speak across time, pulling us into a mystery that refuses to let go. And this is only the beginning of the story. In the next part, we'll dig deeper into the first clues investigators uncovered and how each discovery only made the puzzle more confusing. If you are fascinated by mysteries like this and want to see the rest of the Dyatlov Pass story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze. There are many more strange and unsettling stories waiting to be uncovered. The first 5 bodies were found scattered down the mountain slope, lying in the snow in positions that spoke of desperation. Most wore only shirts, undergarments, or single socks. The lack of warm clothing in a place where the temperature could drop far below zero told its own grim story. These hikers had almost certainly died of hypothermia, their bodies giving out after hours of struggle against the freezing winds. It was strange enough to imagine 9 experienced adventurers abandoning their tent and supplies to run half-dressed into a blizzard. But what came next made the case far darker. 2 months after the first discovery, searchers uncovered the remaining 4 hikers. Their bodies were buried beneath several feet of snow in a ravine about 75 meters farther into the woods. Unlike the others, these victims were dressed more warmly, wearing parts of clothing that appeared to have been taken from their dead companions. One wore a jacket that had belonged to another hiker. Another had wrapped their feet with bits of torn fabric to keep warm. This detail suggested a grim scenario. The group may have tried to survive by using the clothes of those who died first. But it wasn't just their clothing that caught investigators' attention. The condition of their bodies told a far more unsettling story. 2 of the hikers had massive chest injuries. Their ribs were broken, not in 1 or 2 places, but in multiple fractures across the torso. The medical examiner said the force required to cause such injuries was equal to that of a car accident. Another had a skull fracture, so severe that it would have caused immediate disorientation or death. A fourth, one of the women, was missing her tongue and parts of her eyes. The report noted no external wounds to explain these devastating injuries. No cuts, no bruises, no evidence of blunt objects striking from the outside. The trauma appeared to have come from within, as if their bodies had been crushed by an enormous pressure. These findings complicated everything. Hypothermia explained the first 5 deaths, but what about the ravine victims? Could an avalanche have hurled them into the gorge with such force? Some experts doubted it, noting the slope where the tent was pitched wasn't steep enough for a large avalanche. Others argued that if snow had collapsed on them, it would have left visible debris and patterns around the bodies. Yet the site lacked the telltale signs of such a disaster. Instead, the bodies were lying in snow that had built up gradually over weeks, suggesting burial by drifting rather than sudden collapse. The missing tongue was another disturbing element. At the time, it sparked rumors of foul play, perhaps torture or mutilation. But forensic specialists offered another explanation: scavenging animals or natural decomposition in the wet conditions of the ravine. Even so, the tongue detail stuck in people's minds, becoming one of the most infamous and unsettling parts of the case. It fed into the sense that these deaths were not ordinary, that something more sinister was at work. Investigators also noticed that some of the clothing the hikers wore tested positive for radiation. It wasn't a high dose, not enough to cause illness, but it was present. This fueled speculation that the group had come into contact with radioactive materials, perhaps through secret military testing in the area. It was the height of the Cold War, and secrecy was the norm in Soviet Russia. Could the hikers have stumbled into a restricted zone or witnessed something they weren't supposed to see? This idea took hold early on and has never fully disappeared. Even within the official reports, the contradictions were glaring. How could one group die of hypothermia while another suffered injuries resembling those of high-speed crashes. Why did some bodies show signs of radiation while others did not? And what about the tent, deliberately cut open from the inside as if in blind panic? The evidence refused to settle into a neat explanation. Every new discovery only added more questions. Some theorists believe the hikers split into two groups after leaving the tent. The first 5, lightly dressed, may have tried to light a fire near the cedar tree to stay alive, but quickly succumbed to the cold. The others, perhaps with more time to prepare, scavenged clothing and moved farther into the woods, trying to build a shelter in the ravine. If the snow above them shifted or collapsed, it could have crushed their chests and skulls, leaving no external marks. Yet even this theory struggles with the specifics. Why was the force of the injuries so extreme? Why didn't any of the others show similar trauma? As with many unsolved mysteries, the lack of clear evidence leaves space for imagination. Some claim the group was attacked by soldiers or secret police, their injuries the result of brutal interrogation. Others whisper about experimental weapons, sound waves, or shock waves from tests conducted in the wilderness. And then there are those who lean toward the paranormal aliens, yetis, or unknown forces of nature that science has yet to explain. Each theory finds footholds in certain details, but slips on others. What makes the case so gripping is the contrast between the hikers' expertise and the chaos of their deaths. These weren't city dwellers, unprepared for the wilderness. They were skilled, disciplined, and trained for survival. For them to cut their way out of their only shelter, march barefoot into snow, and end up dead in such disturbing circumstances speaks of an overwhelming event, something that stripped them of reason and forced them into impossible decisions. The bodies in the ravine became the focal point of the investigation, not just because of their condition, but because they hinted at a sequence of events that didn't match a simple survival story. If the group had only frozen to death, the mystery might have faded. But broken ribs, shattered skulls, missing parts, and radiation turned a tragic accident into a puzzle that still resists a final answer. What began as a straightforward search for missing hikers had transformed into a case that would live on in legend. Each discovery, and now the horrific injury stacked one mystery on top of another. And with every layer, the Dyatlov Pass incident drifted further from explanation and deeper into the realm of the unknown. The second discovery did not just complicate the investigation, it defined it. From that point forward, the case was no longer just about hikers lost in a snowstorm. It became a question of what kind of force, human or otherwise, could drive 9 people to such a bizarre and tragic end. In the next part, we'll examine the theories that began to form in the wake of these discoveries, and how investigators struggled to fit the evidence into any logical explanation. Adding to the strangeness of the case were the details that emerged once the last bodies were brought in from the ravine. If the injuries to the chest and skull had already puzzled investigators, the mutilations found on some of the corpses pushed the Dyatlov Pass incident into the realm of the truly bizarre. One of the hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, was discovered missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips. Her body also showed damage to soft tissue that could not be easily explained by hypothermia alone. Another hiker, Semyon Zolotaryov, was also found with his eyes missing. A third hiker, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignaud, had a massive skull fracture that suggested the application of force far beyond what a fall in the snow could produce. These were not ordinary injuries, and the fact that they occurred in such a remote, frozen environment only deepened the confusion. Investigators struggled with how to interpret these details. Animal scavenging was one possibility. After all, exposed bodies in a ravine could have been picked apart by small animals or birds over the 2 months before they were found. Missing eyes and soft tissues could fit with that explanation. Yet the missing tongue of Dubinina stood out. Why just the tongue? Why so precise? Some experts have argued that natural decomposition in wet, icy conditions could cause tissue loss in the mouth, but the image of a young woman with her tongue cleanly gone sparked darker speculation. The skull fracture added another layer of contradiction. If Thibeaux-Brignaud had fallen, perhaps while fleeing or stumbling in the ravine, one might expect external injury scrapes, bruises, cuts, yet the skin showed little sign of damage. It was as though the force had been applied internally or through a crushing pressure that did not break the surface. This echoed what the medical examiner said about the chest injuries. trauma on the scale of a high-speed car crash without the expected external wounds, these details fed the impression that something extraordinary had happened, something beyond the reach of normal accidents. Then there was Zolotaryov. Unlike some of the others, he had been found wearing warm clothing and carrying a camera. His background also raised questions. At 37, he was older than the rest of the group, and some records suggested he had military experience during World War II. Two conspiracy-minded thinkers. The fact that his eyes were missing tied him into theories of espionage, secret testing, or cover-ups. If animals had taken his eyes, then it was just another tragic detail. But if not, then why him specifically? The question hung heavy. What disturbed investigators at the time, and still troubles researchers now, was the combination of all these elements. One or two strange injuries could be chalked up to natural causes, decomposition, or bad luck. But taken together, the slashed tent, the missing clothing, the mix of hypothermia and catastrophic injuries, the mutilations, and even the traces of radiation on some of the clothing the case, refused to resolve into a neat story. Each attempt at explanation ran up against facts that didn't fit. The mutilations in particular became the fuel for decades of theories. Some proposed that the group had been caught in secret Soviet military tests, perhaps involving explosives, pressure waves, or chemical weapons. This could, in theory, explain the crushing injuries without external wounds. It could also tie into the idea of a government cover-up, especially in the context of Cold War secrecy. If the hikers had stumbled upon restricted experiments in the Ural Mountains, their deaths might have been silenced under official channels, leaving only fragments of evidence behind. Others suggested more natural causes, though still unusual ones. Perhaps the missing eyes and tongue were the result of environmental conditions in the ravine, where water, snow, and wildlife could interact to strip away soft tissues. In this view, the deaths were tragic, but not mysterious, simply the harsh reality of nature, claiming the bodies over time. Yet even these rational explanations failed to convince everyone because the injuries seemed too precise and too extreme for mere accident. The idea of deliberate mutilation crept into the narrative early on. Some theorists speculated about hostile forces, whether local tribesmen or military personnel, attacking the group. But this ran into immediate problems. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints from outsiders, and no evidence of weapons. The only tracks belonged to the hikers themselves. Whoever or whatever caused their injuries had left no physical presence behind. The mutilations also fueled paranormal theories. Some pointed to UFO sightings, reported in the region around that time. Witnesses claimed strange lights in the sky, glowing orbs that hovered or streaked above the mountains. If the hikers had seen something similar, could they have been caught in an encounter with unknown forces? It sounds far-fetched, but the lack of a grounded explanation gave room for such ideas to flourish. Others whispered about the Menk, a mythical Russian Yeti or mountain creature, said to roam the Urals. The idea of a violent attack by such a being captured imaginations, though no physical evidence of such a creature has ever been produced. Radiation, mutilation, and trauma, with no clear causate, was too much for a single case to bear. As a result, the Dyatlov Pass Incident became more than just a tragedy. It became a stage for the Cold War anxieties, fears of secrecy, distrust of government, and fascination with the unknown. Each detail, especially the mutilations, was seized upon by those trying to find answers in a puzzle that seemed designed to resist them. Even decades later, forensic experts continue to revisit the case with modern tools. Some argue that avalanche theories or localized snow collapses can account for the injuries. Others lean toward a combination of hypothermia and animal activity for the mutilations. But none of these explanations seem to fit seamlessly. The mystery endures because the details, especially the tongue and eyes, still defy simple reasoning. The hikers went into the mountains expecting challenge, cold, and hardship. They were experienced enough to face those dangers. What they couldn't have predicted was the fate that awaited them, deaths marked not only by exposure, but by injuries and mutilations that transformed an ordinary expedition into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in modern history. The mutilations keep the Dyatlov Pass incident alive in public memory. They push the case beyond being a survival story gone wrong into something that feels sinister, whether the cause was natural, human, or something else entirely. And as each year passes without a conclusive answer, the legend of what happened on that frozen mountain only grows. In the next part, we'll move deeper into the theory's military experiments, avalanches, secret weapons, and the clash between rational explanations and the darker, stranger possibilities that continue to circle around the Dyatlov mystery. When the Soviet authorities finally wrapped up their investigation into the Dyatlov Pass Incident, the official explanation was that the hikers had died as the result of what they called a compelling natural force. That was the phrase they used. Vague, hollow, and so unspecific that it left more questions than answers. No one could say what this natural force was supposed to be. An avalanche? A hurricane? A sudden snow collapse? None of these were listed in the files. The statement was so broad it could have meant anything. And for families desperate for answers, it provided nothing but frustration. The case files were quickly sealed after this announcement, marked classified, and tucked away into Soviet archives. For a country already known for its secrecy, this sudden closure fueled immediate suspicion. If the deaths had truly been caused by something natural, why would the files need to be hidden? Why not allow families and experts to see the full details? Instead, the state created an atmosphere where silence spoke louder than any official statement. It suggested that there was something in those files that the public was never meant to see. This secrecy became one of the biggest drivers of conspiracy theories. In the Soviet Union of the late 1950s, the government's grip on information was tight. News was filtered, dissent was silenced, and the military often worked behind layers of classified operations. When people learned that case documents had been locked away, the natural conclusion was that the government had something to hide. Some wondered if the hikers had stumbled onto a secret military test site. The Ural Mountains were remote enough to be ideal for weapons, experiments, missiles, bombs, or even chemical or radiation trials. If the group had wandered too close to restricted areas, could they have been killed, either intentionally or by accident, and then covered up with a fabricated report? Radiation only added fuel to this suspicion. When forensic experts examined the clothing of some of the hikers, they discovered traces of radioactive material. That kind of finding wasn't typical in an outdoor survival tragedy. The official explanation for this was never clear, and the authorities gave no convincing answers. Families asked, how could ordinary students have traces of radiation on their clothes, unless they had encountered something dangerous, something secret, and perhaps even military in origin? For those already suspicious of the state, this detail was proof that the story of a compelling natural force was nothing more than a cover-up. The very language of the official report made it worse. Compelling natural force didn't just sound vague, it sounded bureaucratic, as though the investigators were being careful not to name the real cause. It gave the impression of something hidden behind deliberate vagueness, a phrase designed to avoid pointing fingers. In effect, the statement didn't close the case. It widened it. Instead of reassuring people, it confirmed their suspicions that the truth was being buried. It wasn't just ordinary citizens who questioned the verdict. Even within the scientific community, many experts found the report unsatisfactory. Meteorologists questioned whether weather could have caused such injuries. Avalanche experts noted that the tent's location wasn't in a typical avalanche zone. Medical examiners found the trauma inconsistent with falling debris or snow. Yet the files contained no serious exploration of these contradictions. By sealing the documents, the authorities ensured that their explanation could not be properly challenged, and in doing so, they created the very environment where theories thrived. Some believed that the government may not have caused the incident, but simply wanted it buried to avoid embarrassment. In a country obsessed with projecting strength, the mysterious deaths of 9 young skilled hikers might have been seen as a blemish. To admit that the state could not explain what happened, or worse, that it had failed to protect its citizens, might have been unacceptable. By branding it as a natural force and closing the file, the authorities could sweep the problem under the rug and move on. But secrecy has consequences. The less information the public received, the more they invented their own answers. Over the decades, this created an endless web of speculation. Some people became convinced that the hikers had been mistaken for spies, either foreign or domestic, and executed by Soviet agents. Others thought they might have been witnesses to secret weapons, tests, high explosives, radiation experiments, or even sound-based weapons that had gone horribly wrong. In this view, the government closed the case quickly, not because they didn't know what happened, but because they knew exactly what had happened and needed it hidden. Even the peculiar handling of the bodies played into the cover-up theory. Families of the hikers often spoke about not being allowed full access during the funerals, and some recalled military officials hovering around the process. Photographs taken at the time show soldiers at the site, further fueling the belief that the military was directly involved. Why, people asked, would the army be so deeply tied to a supposedly natural tragedy? The idea of a government cover-up became less a theory and more a certainty for many. The Cold War context only made this suspicion sharper. In 1959, the Soviet Union was at the height of its rivalry with the West. Secret projects, hidden bases, and classified tests were part of daily life, though the public only heard whispers about them. In such an environment, the idea that a group of students might accidentally stumble upon something restricted did not feel impossible. If anything, it felt inevitable, and the swift sealing of the Dyatlov files fit perfectly into that larger pattern of Cold War secrecy. The effect of the official verdict was paradoxical. Instead of closing the case, it made it eternal. The words compelling natural force became infamous, repeated over and over as shorthand for mystery. They gave nothing away and explained nothing, ensuring that speculation would last far longer than the hikers' footprints in the snow. By classifying the files, the government handed the world a blank canvas on which every imaginable theory could be painted. Even when portions of the case files were eventually made available decades later, the damage was already done. The initial secrecy had created such deep mistrust that no amount of released material could erase it. Every document, every report, was scrutinized for signs of alteration or omission. People assumed that anything released to the public had already been carefully cleaned. In that sense, the cover-up, whether real or perceived, became inseparable from the mystery itself. The Dyatlov Pass incident might have faded into history as a tragic hiking accident, one of many that occur in the mountains each year. But the Soviet state's handling of it transformed the story. The secrecy, the vague explanations, the radiation, the military presence, all of these became more than just details. They became proof, at least in the eyes of the public, that something extraordinary had happened. Proof that the truth had been hidden. Proof that the mountain held secrets that might never be fully revealed. And so, when people speak of the Dyatlov Pass incident today, they aren't just talking about 9 hikers. They're talking about the power of silence, the weight of secrecy, and the way a government's need for control can create mysteries that echo across generations. In the final part, we'll look at why the Dyatlov Pass case has endured for so long, how modern investigations have tried to solve it, and why, even after all this time, the mystery refuses to die. For more than 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident has drawn countless explanations. Some are simple, some are bizarre, and some lie somewhere in between. People from all corners of the world have tried to answer the same question. What killed 9 young hikers in the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in 1959? The official explanation of a compelling natural force did little to convince anyone, so the door was left wide open for theories of every kind. One of the earliest ideas was that the hikers were attacked by the local Mansi people, an indigenous group that lived in the region. At first, this seemed plausible. The hikers had camped in an area that was part of Mansi hunting grounds, and perhaps tensions had led to violence. But when investigators searched for evidence of a fight, they found none. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no weapons. The injuries, though severe, didn't match what you would expect from a human attack. Broken ribs and crushed skulls were there, but no cuts or stabs and no defensive wounds. The Mansi theory was quickly discarded, yet it has never fully vanished, often resurfacing in discussions as one of the first possibilities considered and rejected. Then came the theories that pushed far beyond human suspects. Some believed the group had encountered something not of this world, or at least not of ordinary life. The strangest and most infamous suggestion was the Yeti theory. According to this idea, the hikers had been attacked by a massive, ape-like creature that roamed the remote forests and mountains of the Ural. Supporters pointed to the violent injuries and the missing tongue and eyes as signs of a savage attack. A photo from one of the hikers' cameras, which some claim shows a shadowy figure in the snow, only added fuel. Critics, however, argue that the photo was likely just another hiker in the distance, blurred by motion and snow. Still, the Yeti theory has lived on, not because it's the most logical, but because it fits into the aura of mystery that surrounds the case. Others have suggested extraterrestrial involvement. Strange glowing orbs were reported in the sky around the time of the tragedy. Several witnesses from nearby settlements claimed they saw bright lights above the mountains. Could these have been secret Soviet rocket tests, or something far stranger, like UFOs? Some theorists believe the hikers might have seen something they weren't meant to see, and were silenced because of it. Others push the idea further, claiming the hikers were victims of direct contact with beings not of this earth. This, too, remains speculation with no hard evidence. But the mention of glowing orbs in official witness testimony means the UFO theory has always had a foothold. Beyond the outlandish, some explanations have stayed closer to the natural world. Avalanche theories have circulated for decades. A standard avalanche didn't seem likely. There was little evidence of a major snowslide where the tent was found. But in recent years, scientists have explored the possibility of a slab avalanche. In this type, a compact block of snow breaks loose and slides as a solid sheet. Unlike a roaring wall of snow, a slab avalanche is smaller, quieter, and harder to detect afterward. It could collapse part of a tent, crush hikers, and force the group to flee in panic. This would account for some of the blunt force trauma. In 2019, a team of Russian scientists revived this slab avalanche idea using modern simulations. They argued that the angle of the slope where the hikers pitched their tent, combined with heavy snowfall and strong winds, could indeed create a delayed slab release. To make their point, they even referenced data from car crash tests in Disney's Frozen, where computer models of snow were advanced enough to replicate real-life avalanches. According to their research, the slab avalanche could explain why the tent was cut open from the inside. Panic in the dark, a desperate attempt to escape crushing snow. But even this explanation leaves gaps. It doesn't fully explain the radiation on the clothing, the missing eyes and tongue, or why the hikers scattered so far from one another. It also raises the question of why experienced mountaineers like Dyatlov's group would pitch their tent in a spot so vulnerable to avalanche danger, unless the risk wasn't obvious. For some, the slab avalanche is the most reasonable explanation so far. For others, it's just another theory that fails to account for every strange detail. Another suggestion has been infrasound, low-frequency vibrations created by the wind. Scientists like Donnie Eicher, author of Dead Mountain, proposed that a rare weather condition called a Kármán vortex street could have produced infrasound powerful enough to trigger panic, disorientation, and irrational behavior. If the hikers were overcome by sheer terror, they might have fled the tent into the deadly cold. This theory explains the cutting of the tent and the chaotic escape, but it doesn't account for the brutal injuries found on some of the bodies. Military theories remain some of the most persistent. Some argue that the hikers stumbled into a secret test zone where the Soviet Union was experimenting with weapons, perhaps parachute mines dropped from planes. These devices could detonate silently and create shockwaves strong enough to break bones without leaving obvious external injuries, similar to what was found on some of the hikers. This would also tie in with reports of glowing orbs in the sky, which could have been flares or explosions from tests. If the hikers had witnessed something they shouldn't have, it might explain why the case was sealed so quickly afterward. The truth is that no single theory fits perfectly. Each one explains some part of the mystery, but none explains it all. The slab avalanche accounts for blunt force injuries, but not for the missing organs. Infrasound explains the panic, but not the radiation. Military tests explain the secrecy, but not the tent being cut open from the inside. The Yeti explains the violence, but not the lack of footprints or evidence. And UFOs, while dramatic, provide no proof at all. This is why the Dyatlov Pass case refuses to fade away. It's not just one story. It's 100 stories layered on top of one another, each more compelling because of the gaps in the evidence. The hikers left behind diaries, photos, and clues, but they also left behind contradictions, loose ends that resist tying up neatly. When people study the case, they don't just see 9 deaths, they see the unknown. They see nature's danger, human secrecy, and the possibility of things beyond our understanding colliding in one tragic event. Even today, new researchers keep revisiting the case. Every few years, new studies claim to have the answer, only to be challenged by skeptics who point out what doesn't fit. This endless cycle of explanation and doubt has made Dyatlov Pass one of the most haunting and resilient mysteries of the modern age. It is both unsolved and, in many ways, unsolvable. And that is exactly why it endures. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is more than a tragedy frozen in time. It is a story that speaks to our deepest fascination with the unknown, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. Perhaps one day a final answer will emerge, or perhaps the mystery is what will keep it alive forever. If you enjoyed diving into this chilling story and want more mysteries like it, make sure to like this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to Belmoze for more deep explorations into history's darkest and strangest secrets.